I've been waiting for an opportunity to rerun this week's classic interview. It's with Anthony Papa, and I interviewed him back in 2015. And he's from the Drug Policy Alliance, and he's actually a victim of extreme drug sentencing. And this is so important because we are talking a lot lately about these pardons from President Trump. We talked about the pardoning of Alice Marie Johnson. We've talked about the possibility of pardoning others in the future, but also what seemed to be sort of like political or optics or wasted pardons from Donald Trump. And so in reviewing this interview with Anthony Papa, what I want to think about as we listen to it is when we prioritize pardons, what should we be thinking of? What should the principles and priorities be? And with that, let's check out my interview from October of 2015 with Anthony Papa. I'm joined today by Anthony Papa, who's manager of media relations for the Drug Policy Alliance. He also has personal experience with the criminal justice system and the war on drugs. He was sentenced to 15 years to life and ultimately served 12 years in Sing Sing. Anthony, it's great to have you. Let's start, for people who may not be familiar with your story, talk to us a little bit about your conviction.
Thanks for having me on your show. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender. In 1985, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I got involved with drug activity. A person, a bowler on my bowling team, asked me why I was coming late to the league all the time. And I told him my car keeps breaking down. He said, why don't you fix it? I didn't have any money. Well, from that point on, he introduced me to someone who was dealing drugs in the bowling alleys of Westchester County. He asked me if I wanted to make a fast dollar. I said, for what? He says, deliver an envelope from the Bronx to Mount Vernon, and I'll give you $500. At first, I said no because I knew what it was about, and I passed it by. So a couple of months later, it was Christmas time. Things got desperate. I needed money, and he asked me again, and I said, I'll do it. So I wound up bringing this envelope containing 4.5 ounces of cocaine up from the Bronx to Mount Vernon. But I walked into a police sting operation. 20 cops came out of nowhere, was placed under arrest, and I did everything I could do wrong. And eventually I was sentenced to 15 years to life under the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandates mandatory minimum sentencing.
And were you, did this go to trial or did you take a plea deal?
No, I took a plea. They actually offered me 3 to life because they knew I wasn't a drug dealer. But I didn't want to leave my wife and my 7-year-old daughter. And I went to trial. And it was a big mistake because I got walloped with 2 15 to life sentences, one for sales, one for possession of the 4.5 ounces of cocaine. But since I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender, the judge gave me a break, ran the sentences together. So I only had one 15 to life sentence. I served at Sing Sing Correctional Facility.
And talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, were you, what types of other offenders were you imprisoned with? Was it similar to the crime you had been convicted of, or was it drastically different? Violent crime, etc.
It was a mixed bag. I mean, everybody. I went to Sing Sing. It's a maximum security prison, so you're sentenced along with others that had sentenced for murder, rape. Just heinous crimes, and it was a nightmare experience to say the least. When I was in prison, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. I lost my identity, who I was in life, and I became prisoner number 85A2837. What saved my life was my discovery of art, where through another prisoner, I learned that I was an artist. Prison is a very existential environment. And what I mean by that is there's something mystical about being in prison in a 6x9 cage for many years. You find out about yourself. So for me, I found out that I was an artist. And 3 years later, 1988, I was sitting in my cell, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror. I saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage. And I painted this self-portrait, titled it 15 to Life. 7 years later, wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art while I was in prison. I got a lot of publicity on my case, and Governor George Pataki granted me executive clemency.
And
And I,
while you were incarcerated, you also did many things that other inmates don't do, right? I mean, you earned two bachelor's degree, you got a master's degree. You, as you mentioned, you had George Pataki grant you clemency after you were released. You did some acting. You were on HBO's Oz. You've been in several films. But even with all that notwithstanding, you still have been at the mercy of the challenges that exist for formerly incarcerated persons, right? I mean, talk about that a little bit.
yeah, I mean, it was a tough experience. It's a rude awakening. You spend an enormous amount of time in prison, and then suddenly you're free. Like these people coming out now, there's about 6,000 that are coming out under these new changes in the law,
Right.
and they're about to enter society, and they're in for a rude awakening. It's tough every step of the way for an ex-offender. You're blocked with housing, employment. It's hard for ex-offender. You're labeled an ex-offender, and you wear that label for the rest of your life. For me, it's my 18th year of freedom, and I still feel the stigma of being an ex-offender. I just wrote about it in a new book. I actually had to address this issue of people coming home. It's called Men and Women Returning Home in an Age of Reform. It's available on Kindle, on Amazon. And basically what I try to do is use my story as an art, telling men and women who are coming home about my experiences. Because prison doesn't end at the prison wall, it goes beyond the wall. It affects families, loved ones, those on the outside. And one thing people don't realize is that when you come into the free world from prison, you drag along with you all the baggage that you use to survive imprisonment, all the coping mechanisms, and you bring them with you in the free world. And at times they suddenly appear, and you have no control over them. And it's a very dangerous situation when this occurs.
Let's
For
talk a little
ex-
bit about that. I mean, in thinking of sort of the broader problems we have the sort of status quo of the war on drugs. We have mandatory minimums. We have, in many cases, not in your particular case, but we have plea deals and the sort of plea deal structure that is set up to really hurt a lot of nonviolent offenders. You have the sort of punitive nature of incarceration as opposed to rehabilitative. What's the top priority, or in other words, what's the lowest hanging fruit that could be tackled first that would have the most impact?
you mean when people are returning to the free world?
Just in general, in terms of reform, what are the first changes that might have the big impact? Is it talking about mandatory minimums? Is it about what the
I
prisons are like, etc.?
I think that mandatory minimums have become a poison that has destroyed our criminal justice system. Uh, President Obama is speaking about this, and there's legislation now that exists, actually bipartisan legislation, which has passed the Senate, and we're waiting for Congress to act on it, which would reduce mandatory minimum sentencing. What mandatory minimum sentencing does, it takes away the discretion of the judge to look at the totality of facts. So, for example, my case, I got 15 years to life as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. That didn't matter. What mattered was the weight involved of the drug, the 4.5 ounces of cocaine. So under the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandate mandatory minimum sentencing, I passed this envelope with 4.5 ounces. 2 ounce sale or 4 ounce possession at the time I got arrested would give you a 15 to life sentence or better. Men and women have received these sentences 15, 20, 25 years, mandatory minimum sentencing. And these laws have become, under the federal sentencing, these were the original laws in 1973 when it enacted under the Rockefeller drug laws. It eventually became mandatory minimum sentencing laws in the federal government. where every state had some sort of mandatory minimum sentencing law. Those laws have destroyed our system. It has increased prisons to the capacity where the prisons are exploding at the seams. Now, because of it became a monetary issue, everybody, politicians from the left, from the right, are getting together and realizing that it's not cost efficient, these laws. It's a waste of tax dollars, a waste of human lives. Money could be better spent on needy communities to put shoes on shoeless children. So politicians are now acting on this issue, and with the lead from President Obama, hopefully mass incarceration will end.
All right, we've been speaking with Anthony Papa. I'll remind you the new book is an open letter to men and women returning home in an age of reform. He's with the Drug Policy Alliance. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, and if you want to know more about our organization, it's drugpolicy.org, or you could go to my website, 15tolife.com, and see my art and my story. Thanks very much for having me as a guest.